Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining us this afternoon for our CIISec East Anglia branch masterclass. I'm just going to allow 30 seconds or so to let people join, make sure you're all settled and ready for us to start this afternoon. As you can see today, this masterclass is on supply chain ransomware and the Looming Iceberg. Before we get started, I'm just going to remind you of some of our house rules that we have for these webinars. I know a lot of you might be CIISec members already, but if you're not, then welcome to CIISec if this is your first CIISec event that you're attending. If you want to find out any more about CIISec and our memberships, then please do head over to our CIISec website for more information. We really hope you enjoyed the event today. This is just a bit of a reminder of the etiquette that we follow for our webinars. It's pretty much the same across the board. Just to remind you that you will remain muted during this webinar, just to keep things simple. But if you do have any questions, please do type those through to us at any point during the webinar, and we've kindly got Andy Young here who's moderating the session, and we'll be able to pick those up for you. If you really want to ask anonymously, then you can tick the anonymous box, or feel free obviously, and we'll read your name out. Hopefully everything is really straightforward this afternoon for you, but if you do face any problems at all, then do let us know. You can either let us know in the chat or email us at support@ciisec.org, and another member of our team will happily help you with anything that's going on there. As I mentioned, today we've got Andy Young who is moderating this session and hosting. As you can see there, we've got Andy's bio on the screen, so I won't read that out for you, but just a little bit of background. I'll let Andy tell you a little bit more about himself and his background now. So I'll hand over to Andy, and I'm sure you'll do the introductions to our speaker this afternoon.
Yes, lovely. Thanks very much, Sophie. So yeah, thanks ever so much, everyone, for attending. Yeah, my name's Andy Young. I'm a security solutions architect at CIISec Technologies, and one of my main roles is focusing on some kind of relatively new technology with breach and attack simulation. In this context, I assist Mel in the running of these East Anglia branch meetings, and yeah, really looking forward to this masterclass. We was talking before about this, and there's an awful lot of interest in it. It's entitled Supply Chain Ransomware, the Looming Iceberg. And from what I'd say with my own experience, ransomware, of course, is top of mind for all security folk, and combining that with all the other concerns like third-party risk, this is lining up to be a really interesting topic. And presenting this masterclass is Andy Yates. He's a senior solutions architect at Reversing Labs, and he's got a really good background in forensics and reverse engineering malware and the like. So he's an extremely well qualified as well as the SME on this topic. So yeah, without further ado, I'll hand over to Andy, and as I say, please feel free to chip in with questions. We'll come to those at the end of the session. So over to you, Andy.
Yeah, brilliant. Cheers, Andy. So it's great to be here. Thanks everybody for joining today. And exactly as Andy Young said, today's discussion is really about supply chain ransomware. Well, obviously, ransomware has been around for a very, very long period of time, but there have been adaptations and changes over the last couple of years to how threat actors are actually focusing on organizations. Now, what we'll do through today's session is we'll look at a number of kind of key areas, which we'll look at just on the agenda slide, which is next. Here we go. So first and foremost, we'll look at things like the ransomware statistics. What does the data show about what we know about ransomware, how they're targeting particular organizations, and even looking at statistics around things like the attack vectors that they really focus on. We'll then actually look at 3 examples of supply chains. And what I've tried to do during today's session is to put into the context around what currently the conventional methods to secure software through what we would refer in the industry as software assurance techniques, and how that is fundamentally been exploited or circumvented by threat actor groups. We'll then look at some of the key best practices around some of the particular software assurance techniques. And then I've put together my own list of predictions for 2022 and beyond, very specific around ransomware, not just actually looking at software assurance, but just in general around, software assurance and ransomware. And also then just finally finishing with some recommendations that hopefully will be of value to everybody on the call today that you can take away. At the very least, just have an internal discussion and make sure and validate that you've incorporated and assessed it part of your risk assessment for how you do business today. So without further ado, we'll jump into the first slide. So this is an extract from an interview that was done by Recorded Future. And I put this up when I typically talk about ransomware, because I think it articulates a really good question, which is, fundamentally, is ransomware the perfect weapon for cybersecurity or cyber war in the context of, REvil, right? So I'm sure everybody is familiar with REvil. In fact, later on in the presentation, we are going to look at a REvil attack. We're going to look at the CIISec breach. And so this response, obviously very, there's lack of evidence to necessarily support that what he is saying as a response is true, but, it kind of articulates that it's that comment, right? The consequences are not profitable, right? When you take into account compromising certain organizations for their purpose. And it kind of reiterates the fact that all of these threat actors are in business for one particular reason. That particular reason is to make money, right? And the evolution of ransomware has changed from having ransomware as a service to the attack vectors to even how they actually go about executing that ransomware attack and the extortion within a business, right? And we will talk about that later on. But fundamentally, it's an extremely powerful weapon that has always been very, very difficult to protect against, as we'll kind of look through these next few slides. So what we'll do is we'll move to the next slide now. So looking at some of the statistics about ransomware, right? And personally, this data has come from a number of different sources. In particular, this source is part of the IB Group Ransomware Uncovered white paper. And it talks about the ransomware demand being $170,000. Now, in reality, I think that is a very, very small estimation of what that amount is. In reality, it's far beyond that, right? And what we're talking about with that particular statistic is just the demand itself. But we've also got to take into account brand impact. We've got to take into consideration, obviously, any downtime and the cost that's associated. The great example was when we look at things like the CIISec attack. Some of those particular supermarkets that were hit by some of these supply chain attacks, lost their entire POS systems for days. And, that can run into the millions of dollars of impact just from the downtime. The next thing is actually the statistic around the average dwell time. So it's around sort of 13 days, but obviously we know that this is not a hard and fast rule. We think about traditional statistics as well, things like the 7-step kill chain. Obviously, there's discussions in the past that have been around, 12 to 14 days, sometimes longer. But in reality, it depends on that type of threat actor group and who they're actually really trying to target and how valuable that end target really is. And that can span into, weeks, months, and even years of having dwell time of a threat actor. And so obviously some of the detection elements really come and play a factor within that dwell time. Ransomware attacks in particular, obviously it's about getting in and getting out, right? So it's not about necessarily long-term extraction of data. It's about encrypting those disks and then holding that company ransom to pay that. And then finally, that average downtime, right? So they say around 18 days is the average downtime. So, I mean, if you think about traditional statistics, I remember when I was at university, a lot of the kind of academic papers, a lot of the books that I was reading at the time said most organizations couldn't function longer than 3 days if they lost entire internet connectivity. Now, obviously, there's been adaptations to that over the recent years, but 18 days is a considerable amount of time to really be affected by downtime. Bearing in mind, that's average, right? We're not talking about the top figures there for downtime. So there are potentially some organizations that have lost access to services or, certain aspects of data for very, very long periods of time. So if we go to the next slide, so this slide I put together just more of as an awareness of who the most active ransomware groups are. And this is a collation of data that we both have within Reversing Labs and our ransomware feeds, but also a collection of multiple other kind of white papers out there that have done analysis on those particular most prevalent threat groups. Now, in particular, there are threat groups such as REvil that we will talk about today. But it's just more, again, of the most active groups. Now, a lot of these threat groups, like REvil, for example, do use techniques such as ransomware as a service. So they specialize in the extortion of that information from particular from particular organizations, but they're not responsible necessarily for the entire core development, hosting or exfiltration and hosting of that personal data. In the context of REvil, obviously the ransomware was an evolution from the GANCrab and has been associated with a number of other kind of threat groups such as DarkSide as well. So there are separate talks I've done in the past which have focused around REvil as a particular threat group. Obviously, I mentioned it today because it's a very, very hot topic, given obviously the recent news and events that have happened with REvil. But again, there are sessions that have gone into more detail around that. So if we move to the next slide, so this is where it starts to get a bit interesting when we start to look at some of the data, and that's about the particular vectors that these ransomware attacks really concentrate their kind of skills on, right? So first, if we look at obviously that source of the attack, this is really about, where that attack fundamentally resulted from, right? So ransomware groups, people that are responsible for actually developing that ransomware and actually responsible for the extortion of the cryptocurrency or whatever their payment method is. And then we have the vast majority of ransomware as a service. So this has really changed quite drastically over the last few years, as there's been this separation of responsibility within ransomware, and they've become sophisticated almost as a distributed organization in many ways, which feeds in part of the challenge of actually capturing and stopping these particular threat groups, because fundamentally they take advantage of safe housing within certain countries that allow them to continue to execute their objectives. Obviously, there is a no boundary, it's a borderless world that we live in now with cybersecurity, with the things such as the internet, right, and how we do business, but fundamentally regulations, how particular policing groups such as Interpol, Europol are challenged by the fact that it's very difficult to hunt and track some of these particular individuals when they, for example, reside in countries or particular states such as CIS countries. Now, when we start to look at the data on the right-hand side, the primary vector of compromise, this is where I think the data is a little bit scary, right? Because, and perhaps maybe a little bit deceptive in many ways. Now, as you'd expect, a huge proportion of that is obviously external remote services. I'm currently seeing it's 52% of that data. But, obviously today's discussion is really about that supply chain, right? And so according to the data, only 2% of attacks. And that's why I kind of really think what we're looking at here is the next looming iceberg, right? Because on the surface, what we see is that supply chain attacks only form 2% of the broader attack scenarios. But what we should be really concerned about is actually the really advanced threat actor groups that are capable and vested enough in compromising these organizations. And the challenge with supply chain attacks is, rather than focusing on hundreds and thousands of organizations, the time and investment to circumvent a lot of the security tools that these businesses put in place, they only have to compromise one vendor or an MSP, let's say, and the impact can result in 1,000 compromises or 30,000 compromises. A great example is things like the SolarWinds that we'll look at a bit later, and even things like CodeCov as another example we will see. So, the data here, obviously only 2%. Both, I think it is going to grow as we move forward in 2022 and beyond. But also, we've got to think about that initial compromise may only be 2%, but the knock-on effect was thousands of other companies that were fundamentally impacted as a result of that compromise. So now I want everybody, at least as a baseline takeaway, to really think about obviously that kind of supply chain and the data that we have exists today around that. So if we move to the next slide. And so at the start of the presentation, I spoke about how ransomware has evolved over the last few years. And if we think about traditional ransomware when it first came out and some of those first instances of attacks, there was a really key strategy around ransomware. Get it onto an endpoint, start encrypting that drive, and hold the organization responsible for that and extort that data. Now, since then, obviously everybody has started to invest in trying to protect ransomware. And one of those key techniques to prevent ransomware is that, if, for example, all of your preventative technology, whether it's your firewalls, your AVs, your SIEMs, all of those security tools do fail at any point, the kind of last line of defense is that backup, right? So, hey, we've lost 6 hours of development time, or, hey, we've lost, potentially 6 hours of transactions. Well, at the end of the day, we'll just recover it from that backup. And what's happened is a lot of the ransomwares out there now start to include things like logic bombs, for example. So there's an evasion technique to overall detection, but also as a secondary intention, right? And that is to both obviously infect things like the backups, but also include additional capability that involves the exfiltration of the data on that endpoint. And why that's really important is kind of how the industry has actually responded to things like ransomware and threat actor groups with the introduction on the responsibility on the side of the organization, right? To say, you're now responsible. We expect you to have a certain degree of security and that you've done the necessary prevention to prevent a cyber attack. Now, that kind of loose regulation such as GDPR, forms a real challenge because, what a threat actor does is they see that as an additional motive. So what they can do now is they actually exfiltrate that data from the organization, and they will start actually threatening that organization to say, fine, well, recover that data on your endpoint, but you've got a bigger problem. And your problem is now that if you don't pay the ransom, we're actually going to reveal that. We're going to publish that customer data, that private data that within the organization, make you in breach of your regulations by making it all public and having that breach publicly displayed. And so that becomes an additional incentive for those particular organizations to really focus on actually just paying that. And it's all about incentivizing or really pushing that particular organization to pay it. Now, something I talk about at the end around some of my predictions is aspects such as, cyber insurance, right? There's a lot of evidence that, suggests that, some threat actor groups are going to start focusing on insurance organizations for the primary reason about understanding who their end customers are, because customers that typically have, or organizations rather, that typically have cyber insurance are more likely to pay out than ones that do not have that cyber insurance, and therefore could provide a bigger pool of extortion available to those threat actor groups. But the point here is that, evolution is not a static thing, constantly evolves, and they're always trying to find new ways to really push organizations to pay that ransom or to make additional money. And supply chain attacks really are that golden egg to a threat actor group, because again, you can breach one MSSP, really focus on that, or focus on, compromising one vendor, and, the impact could be hundreds of thousands of end customers that fundamentally are then at the hands of that threat actor to pay the extortion. So if we move to the next slide, we'll start to actually look at some of those particular supply chain attacks that we've seen over the last year, or couple of years, in fact, including SolarWinds. And the first one, obviously, I've spoken about a little bit, and that's that Kaseya attack, right? So on 2nd of July, 2021, see, Revil was the responsible threat group, or took responsibility for that. And the key target here was actually infecting some of the VSA stuff, where it pushed an update to that particular, to their particular customers. Now, it affected 50 MSPs. Now, what's interesting with this particular attack is that actually estimated a compromise of over 1,500 businesses, and most of those were small and medium-sized enterprises. And that's quite an important factor when we think about this, because compromising a small and medium-sized enterprise, they're not going to have the enormous security teams that a large organization or enterprise is going to have. And therefore, you could almost think to yourself that actually the target of Kaseya maybe was very, very strategic, in that focusing on organizations as the end goal, you know, those small SMEs, was the key strategy here, because they're not going to be able to recover it. They may not necessarily have an advanced backup procedure in place, and therefore are probably more likely to pay out for that ransomware, assuming that they have the finances to do so. Now, some threat actor groups like Revil, for example, do actually calculate the ransom based on a number of key factors. One of those factors could, for example, be the amount of endpoints that are infected. Some threat actor groups, other than Revil, will focus on more generic, such as, you know, here is a bog standard extortion rate that they need to pay, and it doesn't vary depending on the volume of endpoints compromised. But, you know, Revil, very, very advanced threat group, has really thought about how they actually go about, you know, forming that, because obviously 50% of something is better than 100% of nothing. And I think Revil was very consciously aware of that. Next attack that we'll look at is the Codicove. For those of you that may be familiar with it, this is obviously to help with actually analyzing code to ensure that it's actually free from vulnerability, and doing various different code checks for the quality of the overall code. And so what happened here was, again, Codicove was compromised, and it was just one line. I think it was line 560 something, 605, and it was embedded within, you know, the major code base, the source code for that application, and it just siphoned off using a curl all of the various uploads to the threat actor group. Now, over the years, I've tried multiple times, or over the last year, tried multiple times to really try and understand which threat group was responsible. Now, obviously, there's multiple ways within malware analysis to determine a threat group. One of those is looking at the PDW path, right, for example, the debug path, for example, and also looking at things like various different code similarities or strings. This is a really easy way in which we obviously determined that, for example, the Revil Sodding Kenobi ransomware was an evolution, a 1.1 version of what was actually involved with the Grand Cab threat actor group that retired in around 2019, 2020. But there was nothing really within that Codicove attack that really illustrated any kind of particular similarity of that ransomware code, right? And the key thing here is it wasn't really necessarily a previously known malicious attack, because it was one line of code that was just siphoning off that data. So again, those traditional methods that we use to actually understand that threat actor group, to make associations to threat groups, and even actually detect that something bad is going on, just don't work. Because in reality, this could, in all intensive purposes, when you review that code, look like a completely legitimate line of code. And we'll actually look at that when I show you the source code of that application. And then finally, what we're going to look at is the SolarWinds. Obviously, I think everyone on the call here is well familiar with, obviously, the SolarWinds attack. You know, obviously the Cobalt Strike malware that was embedded, part of the Teardrop, the Raindrop patch updates. Now, it was pushed into that Orion software update, you know, and the delivery of that, the threat actor group Nobelium, happened on March the 26th, 2020, when it was first detected. There's multiple arguments to suggest that they were actually within the company from January 2019, but, you know, most suggest between September 2019. But the impact there was 30,000 customers. And this particular attack was more of what I would call a traditional supply chain attack, in that they've used a known piece of malware that's been embedded within that particular executable that got pushed out as an update, right? So it was fundamentally known malware in many respects, and the behavior of that was malicious, but it's still evaded detection. And it wasn't that SolarWinds wasn't like every other organization. They use very advanced techniques, as do many others, to detect these types of things, such as SAST and DAST, which would go through those kind of conventional security techniques for analyzing software assurance packages, but it still got past that because of fundamental ways in which these threat actors evade detection within those concepts. So if we move to the next slide, we'll start to jump into some of this stuff, right? So conventional software assurance techniques. Now, for those of you on the call, when we think about the software assurance techniques that vendors do, this is important from two perspectives. One, if you are an organization that develops applications yourself today, that could be, a small in-house product that you use and it's your CRM tool, or it could be, for example, you're looking to purchase a third-party application, whether that is a Microsoft product or some private developer that is building an application bespoke for your needs. These are the core concepts that any conventional software assurance will go through, right? And so obviously starting at source control, the kind of really key thing here is about static application security testing, right? So looking at that particular code, the key thing here is it focuses on vulnerabilities, right? So using a lot of third-party applications, what are the vulnerabilities associated? Is there any CVEs that we should be aware of? What's the quality of that overall code? Again, it really does focus just more about the code quality rather than, let's say, embedded malware like we got with SolarWinds, or the behavior of it when we look at things like Codicove. The next thing, and you might be confused when you look at this slide because there's two concepts with the same acronym, and that's SCA, right? Now, SCA in the context here is obviously the software composition analysis, right? So looking at what makes up that particular build. Now, in the industry, we call this a software bill of materials. This is really, really important to understand it for attacks like Log4j. So very quickly understanding that although there could be a completely by design flaw within a software, you need to very quickly understand, what is the composition of that software? What is the dependency? What open source is being used there? And actually, is it legitimate, right? Is it from a legitimate source? Again, this really focuses from a vulnerability standpoint. We're not looking at malware or any previously known signatures or networking. It's really about just the dependency of that software. The next component is build process, right? Now, today's presentation, we could probably spend 40 minutes talking about an entire build process. There's multiple different ways of approaching build process, but there are probably three key ways in which a lot of software vendors look at building those applications part of a build process. One of those is reproducible builds. This is about taking that source control and then producing binaries and making sure that they essentially match to those. And now there are still ways to evade this kind of attack. Obviously, we see this with the inclusion of things like the SolarWinds attacks. It's very, very easy to circumvent these, and also sometimes very, very difficult to produce these environmental elements. There are preventative measures that every software should include to prevent certain attacks like address space randomization. But things like repo builds really prevent you using those types of things because it can actually modify the overall binaries. The next thing is EDRs. Obviously, EDRs do focus on things like behavior. They do look at what's running. But again, trying to produce those environmental behaviors don't necessarily help. And again, we're focusing on a build process rather than something like a release image. And the same with AVs, right? AVs fundamentally work by signatures. We could have an attack that's novel, right? It's never been seen before, and therefore is going to be missed by those types of security solutions. And then finally, the last kind of conventional step is about you've gone through the whole process, you've done your sprint, you've built your software, you've got the release image. This is where we start to look at certain things such as DAST, right? So dynamic application security testing, very much a kind of black box approach to it. Does it do what it's intended to do? Well, again, threat actors can put techniques such as logic bombs within those types of scenarios. Again, ways to actually circumvent this. It's not looking at necessarily the binaries of those applications, but really just about the output. The same goes for an interactive application security testing, or IAST. Again, it might do the expected result, but can you fully assess and monitor all of those kind of outbound connections and understand, is that behavior correct to what we should be seeing? It's very difficult to really, truly do that from an interactive standpoint, because it could still fulfill its job of adding 2 + 2, but it's also doing X, Y, and Z as well. Now, when we start to think about SCA in the context here, this is about things like, for example, source code analysis, understanding is, for example, the source code that we've got correct? Is it good? Is it healthy? You know, again, really from the same standpoint, looking at that perspective of, you know, what's the vulnerability with it? Has it been written well? Are there any particular concerns with that? So again, from the same thing we spoke about with the other components, there's risk there, and the same goes for AV as well. Now, as I said, this is really the fundamental aspects that most organizations will put in place, but as we're going to look in the next few slides, it's very easy to circumvent those types of scenarios. So without further ado, we'll move on to the next slide and we'll start looking at some of these examples. So this is actually the source code from the Kodakov example. Now, what was really interesting with this particular attack is there were multiple attempts from this threat actor. What they initially did was create an additional class. That class was completely empty within the code. There was no malicious embedded malware at all. Later on, within the next version or iteration of that particular release, we then saw the inclusion of this curl, which essentially just steals, you know, from the GitHub, the OS, the username, the computer name, multiple environmental components, CI tokens, credentials, and it was just basically siphoning off to a separate URL that was outside the organization. Now, the difficulty with this type of attack, and going back to those conventional kind of security techniques, is they're really easily circumvented because, again, there was no vulnerable code, right? It was potentially, arguably written in an acceptable manner. You know, it wasn't a import library or an open source bit of code that had been compromised. It wasn't a known bit of malware. So actually, the only real kind of concern here or way to really determine that is about the behavior of that application and the network exfiltration of that data. So very, very difficult to really detect these types of attacks in those scenarios. Now, if we move on another slide, we'll start to look at the CIISec. So, you know, again, the point here was about compromising the VSA, right? And then targeting those managed service providers who then pushed out to their end customers. And the end goal was the deployment of the Revil ransomware, or more particular, the Sodding Kenobi. Now, that particular ransomware attack was actually, in itself, contained a number of evasion techniques. It included a base64 encoded certificate file. So essentially, a lot of companies or organizations to protect against ransomware focus on things like sandboxes. Now, the challenge with sandboxes is that in reality, you've got limited file types that are necessarily supported, and being base64 encoded meant that it didn't necessarily always execute. In addition to this, some of the functional strings that were included part of the Revil ransomware or embedded within it were that it would actually have somebody an operator sat on the other side of the screen who would check that it was actually user interactive rather than necessarily running. So it would also take those environmental details as well. So what was the physical hardware? You know, is the user interacting? And so it'd actually be a human element, right? They almost understand as a threat group that automation is relevant in only a certain number of scenarios, and actually the human element to actually confirm that it isn't running in a sandbox is an absolute key component within that. Now, once obviously they were happy with it, they would obviously encrypt the drive and flash up a nice little screenshot saying, you know, Mr. Andrew Yates, you've been you know, compromised, you know, please, you have 48 hours from this point to pay your ransom. So those environmental credentials were taken. Now, again, I've got another session where I go into much more detail. I look at the code, look at the strings, look at the functional similarities of the Revil attack done separately. So we're not going to talk about it in any more kind of great detail on today's call. Now, if we move on one more slide. So the SolarWinds, and again, you know, I'm sure everybody has had a lot of discussions over the last couple of years, really talking about the SolarWinds. From a fundamental standpoint, it was the task host SVC executable that was injected into that MS build executable. Now, the key thing here is that, you know, obviously the source control was good, the build process, they had elements around that to ensure it, Where it went wrong was the inclusion part of that MS build executable that was pushed into the Orion source code, and then fundamentally pushed out. And so we can see the kind of core elements there, the certificates that were actually signed but broken, of the SolarWinds Orion core.b business layer DLL file that actually went into the install patch. Now, if we jump through a slide, again, thank you. What we see here is that it's that trust boundary, right? It was a developer compromise. And so, that kind of build structure and then pushing it out as a supply chain attack fundamentally targeted with two different types of attacks. We've got teardrop and we've got raindrop. So teardrop and raindrop were fundamentally very, very similar. Teardrop focused on the decryption and execution of the malicious code, which was a Cobalt strike attack. The raindrop, in comparison, was slightly different. What that particular attack focused on was actually an adaptation of the 7-zip source code that was actually modified for a malicious intent and malicious purpose. So again, obviously, there were elements potentially to detect it from those elements seen as there was malicious, but again, it was novel, right? It was not known. We were not aware of that particular string, and this is part of the challenge with things like AVs, right? Firstly, AVs typically focus on the first 300-400 meg of a particular file, but in addition to that, don't necessarily, well, very much focus on signature-based detection. And there are very, very easy ways to evade it, whether you push the payload further down, you put logic bombs into it, and of course, obviously looking at novel, so modifying the particular hash of that malware is obviously a good technique. And there's obviously many examples of that, such as ransom crypt as an example, where obviously a unique hash of the particular malware injected into an object every single time that was distributed to an end customer. So again, and that's good ways to obviously circumvent threat intelligence data that really, again, focuses on signature-based detection. So if we move on to the next slide, we just see here, this is, apologies, this is what we call differential behavioral analysis within the industry. So this is one way of really about understanding what's changed between a particular executable from one version to the next, right? So the particular flow, which I talk about later with securing applications, is obviously first and foremost identifying potentially highly critical or vulnerable applications that are most important to the business. Maybe that's from a sensitivity perspective, but probably from an output of a risk assessment you've done, and you've identified that the data or the intended purpose requires additional protection. This particular application, obviously the Sunburst one, when you analyze it, this was the indicators, the capability that were included, right, compared to against that gold image, and then what had been actually added in based on that threat actor group. So the ability to obviously read things about one or more processes, contains reference to MD5 algorithm, multiple things here, certs expired. This was the functionality, that backdoor that the Sunburst had as a result of that threat actor group. So the purpose of differential behavioral analysis is really about, once you've got the gold image, understanding what's changed. And that can be a really, really easy, quick way to determine, okay, how has this application evolved over time? And do we expect the additional behavioral indicators for its capability based on the changes or modification of those applications? And so obviously that initial assessment of an application is quite resource intensive, right? So it can be massively different from one version to another if you constantly do that. It's the same for Codicove, in fact. So if you do a differential behavioral analysis, that would have been one method to detect that type of attack, because you suddenly see an outbound connection occur to an IP address that's outside of your organization or outside of the domain of the Codecov vendor, if you're obviously looking at it from a third-party perspective. But again, that differential analysis is a really, really key behavior that we need to start adopting in industry to really detect these types of attacks. So if we move on one more slide, So again, yeah, as I said on the last slide, enumerating system information, tampers with user account privileges, escalation of privileges, tampers with system shutdown processes, and then references a number of, obviously very powerful DLLs, kernel 32.dll, window APIs as well. So the challenge here, and really kind of the key takeaway, is that whether you are a vendor or a software developer or even an end user of software, it's very, very easy to be susceptible to these supply chain attacks and those traditional methods that we've spoken about, whether it is DAST or SAST or SCA. I mean, there's huge volumes of application security, much like we do in a SOC use case. Now, they are very easily circumvented in the right manner. And that's because threat actors are so heavily incentivized. There's so much money to be made. And when we think about supply chain, again, they don't have to have, they start going for this big game hunting, right? This is what I predict the future challenge to be, is that they will invest more time, more effort, take longer over compromising a vendor or an MSP to really focus on that kind of big game hunting, right? So get down one, and then the impact can be thousands or hundreds of thousands of organizations. And so, ensuring that when we purchase third-party software, that these validations have been done is critical to securing your organization. So with that, if we move to the next slide for me, please. So I kind of mentioned this earlier. There's two personas, right? And the two personas are, you are an organization purchasing third-party software. Is certainly how I see it, right? You're either somebody who's purchasing third-party software, like I said, that could be, purchasing Kaseya or Kodakov or Microsoft or Apple, whatever that software might be, or you are the publisher workflow. So you're developing that application and therefore want to reduce the supply chain risk to your end customers, whether that's for brands or, obviously just keeping our customers safe from a regulatory standpoint, and so on and so forth. Now, on the next slide, what I'm trying to articulate here is that these are common discussion points from when I go into when I do consultancy and I'm speaking to organizations, and I try to understand how do most organizations today protect against supply chain attacks. And from a buyer's perspective, this is the common discussion points, right? So we have compliance questionnaires, and absolutely, I'm not suggesting for a second we should be removing or not doing compliance questionnaires, but it doesn't form a complete picture for that protection, because a questionnaire is only going to form part of that picture. A company could, for example, do SAST, right? They could do DAST. You can ask the question, but if you ask them a question such as, is your application free from malware? Well, it's going to be a response that's to the best of our knowledge, we are free from malware. But how do you ensure that when you ingest a piece of application that it is free from that? And this is when I come to later around how we need to approach that application and how you secure it before it gets deployed, almost in a zero trust methodology approach to that vendor application. The next thing is vulnerability scanning, right? Oh, well, we do source code analysis. We have bill of materials. We ensure that the code is of high quality and there's no CVEs. Again, backdoor code wasn't in the repository, nor is it a code quality issue, exactly as we've seen with a number of those attacks. So again, like CodeCov, very, very easy to circumvent. And then finally, things like AV is another common discussion point. Well, we use AV, right? So when we run the application, if it is malicious, we're going to obviously detect that. Well, again, they focus on signatures. The backdoor is well hidden, so obviously it's only scanning the first 400 meg of the header. They put it further down in the payload. The amount of evasion techniques are enormous that threat actors use to circumvent these types of security tools. So again, how we actually analyze those applications need to be very consonant of the particular techniques that these threat actors are using, and it needs to evolve over time as they start to take advantage of additional vulnerabilities with application or security tools in this manner. So if we then look at the next slide, which is looking at it from the publisher standpoint, well, again, as we said before, source control, right? The build machine wasn't compromised. It could be injected at a later point within the process. It could be, an insider threat where we got a developer who's written some additional code. Well, that could be a challenge. The source control, things like SAST and DAST, SCA, source code analysis or composition analysis, it's all focused heavily on vulnerability. It doesn't look about embedded malware or the behavioral aspects, or is the certificate chain broken? Is the sensitive information, was the mitigation of that application appropriately secured for the intended purpose of that deployment? These are all questions that are left open when we think about how we look at security from a traditional standpoint today. And then things like scanning malware for binaries, right? Well, exactly as we looked at it from the last standpoint with AVs, the backdoor was well hidden and there's no signature. So it's the same story when we just focus on analyzing binaries for malware, right? And we need to go beyond just these kind of traditional methods. So if we jump through to the next slide. This is a slide that I've put together that kind of really focuses on some of the key challenges that, whether we're talking about supply chain attacks or ransomware in general, organizations are challenged with, right? And in terms of that threat actor, this is some of the things that they take advantage. So first off, super large objects, sandboxes, AVs, EDRs, XDRs, they fundamentally have limits to the volume of the file that they look at, right? Anything beyond 600-700 meg is going to be really challenging for anything within a sandbox. AVs only look at the first 400 meg. As a threat actor, they're very aware of what security tools, and so they will move the payload further down. They will embed the malware within a larger object that makes it difficult to analyze. And the same goes for that layers upon layers, right? Some security tools will only analyze a particular tool that's 2 or 3 layers down. It's not going to go multiple layers down within an application and fully scan that object to ensure that it is actually not a known malware or contains any behavioral aspects that could be malicious. The next thing is about the file format. So again, a really common technique for threat actors is the file formats. So a lot of security tools only support a handful of file formats. So again, these really obscure file formats, base64 encoding, and all the various different other challenges, it just means it won't get executed. And all these security tools, part of the challenge is it will produce a result that's unknown. Now, unfortunately, unknown has 2 meanings to it in reality when we think about security. Unknown means it's just never been seen before, or it's, been unable to process it, or it is, or it is just not bad. And so that's where part of the challenge is in industry. We need to change to say, actually, it's important to know if something is goodware. So there needs to be this driver, I think personally within security, to start talking more about actually defining what is goodware, right? And how do you ensure that? And obviously there is a good element of trust that we need to build within these particular, validation techniques to ensure that, when we say something is good, it really is good. Next thing is about, its key behaviors. So as I said before, they look at multiple behaviors of the endpoint, drivers, hardware specification, user interaction. They're all techniques to really understand if something's running. And then finally, certificates. Certificates really are so incredibly important. The amount of times I see applications from very, very large vendors that come out and it's the certificate chain's broken, or it hasn't been signed correctly, or it's modified after after it'd been signed in some way and therefore broke the certificate. It's a really good sign for indicating if something has been modified and can actually help to reduce down some of those risk vectors associated. But anyway, the point of this slide is really just about awareness of some of those key challenges that you need to think about when you start to look at ransomware attacks, whether that's supply chain or not. And so on that point, if we move to the next slide. So I've been trying to build up to this in terms of putting together what is an ideal approach to defending against the really advanced supply chain attacks that I think are inevitably going to be increasing over the next few years. The first thing is, having a good process in place that fundamentally focuses on a strategy of a golden image, right? Whether that is software that you developed in-house for use in-house or externally selling it, or purchasing that software in, having that gold image and decomposing that golden image and fully understanding it. Understanding the software behaviors beyond just the typical kind of DAST approach, we need to really understand what is the behavior of that. There are obviously really good techniques out there of using things like machine learning across large data sets to actually understand, has that behavior been associated with previously malicious stuff? So a great example is, if you've got a PDF document or an executable document and it's using WinCrypt 32.dll, then you question, should that application really be encrypting? Was that the intended purpose? Should it be able to encrypt that drive? Next thing is, obviously, as some of these other tools do, is really focus on vulnerabilities. Is there any CVEs associated to it? And what is the impact of that CVE? Because that has a knock-on effect for how you deploy and actually understand the deployment of that application. So we need to think about mitigation techniques, DEP, ASLR, these are address-based randomization. These types of techniques are incredibly important when we think about the intended purpose of the application. We need to mitigate and ensure from a code standpoint and from a security standpoint, these applications are mitigating various different risks within that. Certificates I've already discussed, incredibly important, very, very common way of getting an early indication if something has been broken, if there is any inclusion of malware within it, or past that build process or source code analysis. And also it's important to do analysis of sensitive information. Again, private keys need to be secure, right? We need to ensure that any sensitive data within the application is appropriately secured, that it is sensitive, that it isn't accessible within the application. We also need to think about third-party components. So again, this goes back to things like Log4j, right? Sometimes it's inevitable that we will get a third-party component that, although was intended in a completely legitimate way, and it works as per intended purpose, it creates a vulnerability. Now, one of the challenges is really about a software bill of materials, understanding that if you've got an application, whether you've developed or not, understanding what is the ingredients list to that application so that you can very, very quickly identify and say, actually, these applications we have within our business are vulnerable to this version of Log4j. And therefore, we need to prioritize part of our change control. These applications need to be updated because they're susceptible to these attacks, or we need to limit privileged access or network access to that particular application. Again, no organization has unlimited budget. So it could even be saying, well, actually, we only have 40% of our estate being monitored by these security tools. We need to potentially focus on moving that while we figure out what the plan is to mitigate that third-party component into this particular network, where we can actually have a closer monitoring of that particular application. Very realistic change doesn't happen overnight. And then finally, obviously, the really blatantly obvious thing, which is quite commonly missed in today's security techniques, and that's checking for embedded malware. SAST, DAST, SCA, all of these processes don't look for embedded malware. They focus on vulnerabilities. But actually, if we think about these threat actors like Revil and Noblium, they focus on things like Cobalt Strike, right? The well-known attacks, even the Sodom Kenobi were well-known. And therefore, if we analyze an application and check for these behaviors, it can really, really help us to put us in a strong position at actually preventing it before. And it's that trust model with those end vendors that we purchase from. It's applying a zero trust methodology to those vendors. And if we go to the next slide, this is where we start to kind of drill down into some of those predictions I'd spoken about earlier. So as I've kind of said throughout today's presentation, supply chain attacks really will, I think, increase. I think the exfiltration of files and the traditional encryption will certainly increase. I think the focus here is more ransomware as a service orchestrators. There'll be specialities out there where some individuals and groups will focus on the development of that ransomware, but we're seeing an increase in potentially the affiliate program associated with some of those RAS orchestrators. I think big game hunting, again, is a very appealing move for a lot of threat groups, right? Because the more a signature gets out there, the more some of these unique behaviors or even zero-day compromises start to become prevalent, right? If you think about ransomware, the less data that's available, the less data you have to develop a decryptor. So, as we think about it, they're going to go after big game hunting. They're going to focus on potentially certain organizations with large budget, with cyber insurance, and things like MSSPs and so forth, and may even focus on just actually those individuals, because then it's more difficult to decrypt that data. But again, big game hunting in the context of supply chain is going to be more difficult because that's a volume game in many respects. As I said before, specific targeting of those that have cyber insurance. Obviously, if you think about it logically, if a company has cyber insurance, there is at least that backup plan. The company is fundamentally focused on just getting their data back, and they purchase it for a reason, right? You wouldn't crash your car, write your car off, and then say, crikey, how am I going to pay for a new car? You're just going to be really pushing on your insurer to buy you a new car or replace that vehicle. Next thing is increase in APT recon. In the context of supply chain, I think threat actors will start to shift a lot of the effort on making sure that when they compromise an organization or how they approach the compromise, they put in more sophisticated techniques. Now, this is very, very difficult to protect against, because fundamentally it could be everything from listening devices next to your office to understanding if you're running a recruitment drive, which was essentially part of what happened there with the RSA security breach. And then lastly, obviously the obfuscation of those particular attacks. They're constantly evolving them to evade security tools. What I've tried to put together in that list of recommendations is based on today's knowledge of the most common supply chain attacks and the techniques used, and tried to find the most efficient way of preventing those, or how we could have prevented what we know are attacks today. So the differential analysis for Codicove and looking at embedded malware for SolarWinds, so on and so forth. But fundamentally, they're going to focus on things like encoders, packers, logic bombs, user interactions, driver detection. So just be very consciously aware, when you assess what you have in-house, what do you do today? And if you had this type of malware, how would you detect against those types of attacks? And so with that, we'll move on to the last slide I promised, which is recommendations. Now, I'm a really big advocate for our policings globally. I think in Europol, Interpol, they do an absolutely fantastic job with what they've got available to them, but it is a borderless challenge that they're fundamentally faced with. And there are a lot of these sovereign states, as I would call them, that harbor these cyber criminals. And until regulation catches up on a more global level and there is more policing available to actually take down these threat actor groups, which is incredibly challenging because they are very disparate, they are globally isolated, and they're very good at hiding themselves. But the challenge is just going to get worse. We can try to protect it ourselves as an organization, but more lobbying for global policing is I think paramount to success in this world. I think a move towards a hybrid model of malware analysis. So, if you do in-house malware analysis today, think about, if you're doing dynamic analysis, that's only part of the picture. It's time consuming, it has scalability issues. In a separate discussion, I'd really go into more detail talking about malware analysis from a SOC standpoint in a very detailed degree, and we look at static and dynamic analysis. Next thing is Yara hunting. I think Yara hunting, in my opinion, is probably one of the most underrated techniques available today to detecting malware. and it's an incredibly powerful way of detecting malicious behavior. So for example, if you do end up not being able to include any of those approaches that I discussed or recommendations I discussed previously, something like Yara can at least help detect it further down that chain if you do have malicious application, or look at the behavior of that. Obviously, a key thing is ensuring that backups, obviously one of the first few slides we looked at was how ransomware has evolved. Backups can, for example, be encrypted, contain those logic bombs. So just think about, if you do have backups, we need to be certain that ransomware is free from those backups before it executes on its objective. And then, of course, the main theme of today's presentation, which is that software assurance. So I think in-house developers obviously have a number of these techniques in place, but just be very consciously aware of that zero trust that we need to employ when it comes to those. And I know it's never easy, right? We don't have unlimited budgets, so we need to think about what's most important. But I think in the context of what's happened with the CIISec and SolarWinds, it's a problem that's only going to grow, and therefore starting to think about how we approach that earlier rather than later is no bad thing. Anyway, on that note, we'll move to the final slide for, I think it's questions. Just want to say thank you very much for your time, and I hope it was of value.
Thanks, Sandy. That was really, really super interesting. Conscious of the time, but we do have some questions, and the first one from Arthur Rabjohn is kind of speaks to the point you were making in the recommendations there, about state-sponsored threat actors, and in itself it's kind of probed a few thoughts in my mind as well, which if we've got time I'll happily talk about as well. But so the question is, do you think the Russian crackdown on REvil is genuine, and have they been diminished / removed as a threat? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I think the intent to crack down on them was absolutely, the intention was to take them out, but it's a disparate group. So I was actually speaking quite recently with somebody who works at Europol, and the conversation was, the intention here is to take out the threat group, but it's an incredibly resilient model that they fundamentally employ. It's like taking out a weed. You take out one weed, another one's just going to pop up in its place, and it's very easy almost to replace those individuals. And it is a disparate model, right? So it's just incredibly difficult. And in fact, if you look at the data, when I first saw the REvil, takedown, where it was, I think it was 11 individuals that were actually arrested, both obviously within Europe and across the US as well. We look at the data, and there's very little impact to the overall compromise of those end users. So, they're still compromising companies. They're still out there performing this task. And it's the way that they form that kind of almost hierarchical organizational structure, which is flat in many respects. They all have jobs, they all have responsibilities, but they're, it's easy to interchain people within that model. And I think that's part of the challenge we've got there. Andy, I don't know what your thoughts are on it, actually.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting, because if you look at the dark web marketplaces, it's interesting because you see those get shut down, and you see the same sellers, move on to the next one. So it's kind of a bit kind of whack-a-mole. But the other kind of interesting thing I think about this is that, quite ironically, they've got, the service that they use is one of, got their own supply chain, if you like. So, we've seen that with ransomware as a service, before that service is taken up, you've got another element in there with initial access brokers who will find access to potential targets based on what they know to be the oncoming trends, like maybe cyber, insurance companies. And so they sell that access to the brokers and stuff. And then so essentially, I think it's quite ironic that they've got their own kind of supply chain. And I also think it's you know, the Colonial Pipeline was quite interesting, because the way, obviously we saw in there that you know, the way there's code embedded in the malware to make sure that it wasn't going to attack, you know, keeping on the Russian theme, any kind of Russian OSs. And of course, you know, the approach to taking those, or having those guys taken down, was more about one of trust within the dark web. So, you know, we saw that the dark side guys fell out of favor with some of the other threat actors, and the FBI kind of went after the Bitcoin wallet. So I guess slightly different approach. They're more affecting their supply chain. So
yeah, definitely. I mean, yeah, it obviously focused on checking. It's a really good point, actually, because it focused on checking the keyboard that's actually installed. So you look at the ransomware from Revil, the Soldin Kenobi, and you look for a search for strings of 8 characters, you can see there the CIS keyboard check, you know, and it's plain as day. So it gives some indication of where they're probably located in a CIS country, right? And it's that's safe housing within that sovereign state.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, this is very, very interesting subject, this. If we have time, we do have one more question here. Do Revil offer payment plans? Seen some larger companies use these attacks as paid up pen testing.
Yeah, I'm not actually familiar with what their payment plans are. I mean, obviously, primarily they just try to get the extortion of as much of the cryptocurrency as they can. I'm trying to remember what the 2 cryptocurrencies. There's like an obscure one that they use, which is a little bit harder to trace. I mean, obviously, cryptocurrency is traceable now. Whatever anybody thinks, you know, you can trace it, as we've seen with the FBI and, in fact, the Colonial Pipeline, obviously the 4.4 million crypto. But yeah, it's a good question. And personally, I actually don't know. I've not gone into enough detail to look at what the payment plans are for Revil. But maybe that's a good topic for another session.
Yeah, it was interesting how they kind of swapped from, I think they swapped from, I can't remember the ones, but yeah, the way they swapped to one that's considered a bit more secure is quite telling. That's quite clearly a weakness for them. So, okay, so we have gone over time slightly. Hopefully everyone found value in that. I certainly did. I thought it was extremely interesting. I could probably wrap it on myself for a little bit longer, but if we look to wrap up there, thanks ever so much for that. I hope everyone found it as interesting as me, and yeah, I'll hand back to Sophie for some closing remarks.
Thank you so much, both Andy and Andy, for joining us this afternoon, and to anybody who stayed with us till the end for the Q&A. Just a few things to mention before we leave is that after, you should receive a link to the recording by the very latest the end of the week, so please do look out in your emails for that. There'll also be a link to a very short feedback survey. Any comments that you can share with us, there's just a few questions really, and any upcoming topics that you'd like to see covered in our masterclasses. We'd really love to have your thoughts and feedback on that too. So we'll include a link there. It should take no longer than 2 minutes to do that. And the other thing I really wanted to shout out as well is the next East Anglia branch masterclass, which is taking place on the 16th of March. Some of you may have attended the first part of this, which was on wireless security, and the one on the 16th of March will be a progression of this talk. So please do look out for that on our LinkedIn, and we'll be doing several different promotion posts for that, and we'd love to see you attend. But for now, I think that's everything. We'll be sending the slide pack out to you as well. But I just wanted to say another big thanks to everyone who's joined, and have a lovely evening.
Yeah, thanks, Yatesy. Excellent.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Cheers all. Thank you.
Bye.
See ya.
Bye.